Before starting the video, let us know where you're watching from and what time you're watching. The road that follows you. Chapter 1. The first step. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of amber and crimson as Ellie tightened her scarf against the chilly wind. She had moved to the quaint little town of Whispering Pines a month ago, hoping to escape the noise of the city and her own turbulent past. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and the nights were eerily quiet, the perfect setting for a fresh start. That evening, Ellie decided to explore the forest trail behind her cottage. Her neighbor, Mrs. Goodwin, had warned her not to wander too far after dusk. Strange things happen out there at night, the old woman had said, her milky eyes clouded with something between fear and pity. Ellie had dismissed it as local superstition. The trail began innocuously enough, winding gently through towering pines that whispered secrets to each other in the wind. She walked for about an hour, the crunch of leaves beneath her boots the only sound accompanying her thoughts. But as the last vestiges of daylight faded, the air grew heavy, and the forest seemed to close in around her. She was about to turn back when she noticed something odd. The trail she had been following no longer looked familiar. She had been certain of its direction, yet the path now curved sharply to the left instead of continuing straight. Ellie hesitated, her heart quickening. "You're imagining things," she muttered, shaking her head. But as she retraced her steps, the path twisted and turned in ways that defied logic. The trees loomed taller, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The wind carried whispers now faint but persistent, and they seemed to be calling her name. By the time she found her way back home, her hands were trembling, and her breath came in short gasps. As she closed the door behind her, she could have sworn she heard faint footsteps on the gravel outside, but when she looked, the path was empty. Chapter 2. The Footsteps. Over the next few days, Ellie tried to dismiss the incident as nothing more than her imagination running wild, but the feeling of unease lingered. It wasn't just the path, she felt as though something was watching her, even in the safety of her own home. It started small, shadows that flickered where no light should fall, the sound of footsteps echoing in the night when she was alone. One evening, as she washed the dishes, she glanced out the window and saw a figure standing at the edge of the trail. It was too dark to make out any details, but she knew someone was there. Her heart pounded as she flicked on the porch light, but the figure was gone. Mrs. Goodwin's warnings came rushing back. Ellie decided to ask the old woman about the forest. "Ah, so you felt it," Mrs. Goodwin said when Ellie brought it up. Her voice trembled as she sipped her tea. "They say the trail behind your house is cursed. It's not like other paths, it follows you." Ellie frowned. "What do you mean it follows you?" Mrs. Goodwin's gaze was distant, her hands clutching her cup as if for dear life. "Once you step on it, it knows you. It changes, shifts, and twists so you can never leave it behind. Some say it's alive, feeding on fear. Others think it's a doorway to something darker." Ellie tried to laugh it off, but her voice sounded hollow even to her. That night, she bolted her doors and windows and kept the lights on until dawn. Chapter 3. The Road Grows Closer. The days turned into weeks, and Ellie's world began to unravel. The path wasn't confined to the forest anymore. She saw it everywhere, a faint line etched into the gravel outside her home, a dark streak across the pavement when she went into town. It appeared in her dreams, an endless road stretching into shadow. One evening, as she drove home from the grocery store, her headlights caught something on the road ahead. It was the same figure she had seen before, now illuminated in stark detail. It wore a tattered cloak, its face obscured by a hood, and its hand was outstretched as if beckoning her. Panic surged through her veins as she swerved to avoid it, but when she looked back, the road was empty. She slammed on the brakes, her hands trembling on the wheel. For a moment, she considered turning around and leaving Whispering Pines for good, but the thought of abandoning everything she had worked for held her back. When she got home, the path was waiting for her. It stretched from the forest right up to her doorstep, darker and more defined than ever. That night, she dreamed of endless corridors lined with trees that whispered her name. She woke up drenched in sweat, the echoes of footsteps fading from her room. Chapter 4. The Truth. Desperate for answers, Ellie sought out the town's library. Buried in the dusty archives, she found an old journal belonging to a man named Jonathan Cartwright. The entries were fragmented and incoherent, but they spoke of the same phenomenon, a road that changed and followed. One passage stood out. The road is not of this world, it's a hunger, a trap. It takes, and it does not let go. The only way to escape is to face it, to walk it to its end. But no one knows where the end lies. Ellie's stomach churned. The journal's final entry was smeared with ink and illegible, but the last word sent a chill down her spine. It wants me, and now it will have me. Chapter 5. The Walk. Ellie knew she couldn't run from the road anymore. It had embedded itself in her life, her mind, her very soul. If she didn't confront it, she feared she would lose herself entirely. On a moonless night, armed with a flashlight and a heavy coat, she stepped onto the trail. The air was colder than it should have been, and the forest was unnaturally silent. As she walked, the path seemed to stretch and walk, pulling her deeper into its embrace. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes, time lost all meaning. The whispers grew louder, voices overlapping in a cacophony of despair. Shapes moved in the shadows, their outlines flickering like static on a broken screen. Ellie's flashlight sputtered and died, plunging her into darkness. And then she saw it, a doorway at the end of the path, framed by twisted trees. Beyond it lay an abyss that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. Ellie's legs trembled, but she forced herself to step closer. "Why me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the din. The whispers coalesced into a single, chilling response: "Because you look." Chapter 6. The End of the Road. Ellie stood at the threshold, her heart pounding like a war drum. The abyss seemed to beckon her, promising release and ruin in equal measure. She took a deep breath and stepped through. For a moment there was nothing but darkness. Then she found herself standing in a place that defied comprehension. The road stretched infinitely in all directions, lined with the faces of those who had walked it before her. They stared at her with hollow eyes, their mouths moving in silent screams. Ellie realized the truth: the road didn't just follow, it consumed. It was a living entity, feeding on the fear and despair of those who dared to walk it. And now it had her. But Ellie wasn't ready to give up. She closed her eyes, drawing on every ounce of strength she had left. She thought of her life before the road, of the warmth of the sun and the sound of laughter. She refused to let the road take those memories from her. When she opened her eyes, the faces around her began to fade. The road trembled beneath her feet, its grip weakening. Ellie took a step forward, then another, and another. She walked until the darkness began to lift, until she could see the faint glimmer of dawn on the horizon. When she emerged from the forest, the road was gone. The whispers had fallen silent. Ellie collapsed to her knees, tears streaming down her face. She had faced the road and survived, but she knew she would never forget the horror of what lay within. Epilogue. Years later, Ellie moved far away from Whispering Pines. She built a new life, one filled with light and love. But every now and then she would catch a glimpse of a shadowy path out of the corner of her eye, and she would remember the road never truly lets go. But she had learned to keep walking.